I'm in the philosophy department here and the director of the Humanities Forum here at PC. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the first forum of this academic year. We have a real treat for us all today. Before we get to our main event, let me just remind you that each Humanities Forum has a reception afterwards. We're always in the great room. Please come and join us after that for some conversation to meet our speaker and continue the conversation. Without further ado, let me welcome up Professor Holly Taylor Kuhlman from the Theology Department to introduce our guest this afternoon. Once again, welcome.
Hello, good afternoon. It's appropriate, I guess, to begin our year's events with a talk on the beginning, talk on Genesis. We have with us Richard Clifford, Professor Emeritus of Old Testament at Boston College's School for Theology and Ministry, and also a priest of the Society of Jesus. After completing doctoral work at Harvard, Father Clifford has taught biblical studies at the Weston Jesuit School of Theology from 1970 until 2008, and also during that time served as president of that institution. With a complex and I think ultimately successful reconfiguration, he became founding dean of the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry beginning in 2008 and taught there until 2010. Among his professional scholarly interests are the ancient Near Eastern background of the Bible, the biblical wisdom literature and the Psalms, and two of the interests that he combines as he speaks to us today, the book of Genesis and the interpretation of the Christian Bible in contemporary culture. I can also tell you, as somebody who taught on an adjunct basis at Boston College during the time that Father Clifford was teaching there full-time, on a personal note, that he is also well known for kindness and good humor. So he brings many, many gifts to us today. Please welcome Father Clifford with me.
To kick off this series appropriately on beginnings. I'm happy to talk about a topic that is of great interest to me, and I hope will be for you too, but that may not be evident until the talk proceeds for a bit. I'd like to talk this afternoon, about a part of the Bible you probably have heard about, but maybe not read in detail. Now I realize that some of you have just had this course that you probably have read it in detail. To wit, the 7-day creation account that begins the Jewish and Christian Bible. And for many people, they only see it cited or quoted a little bit in TV documentaries about the creation of the universe. Then we'll talk about Adam and Eve. Many people know Adam and Eve only from cartoons. I went online and counted more than 30 cartoons just in the New Yorker alone. And my favorite was a cartoon of the couple walking dejectedly away from the Garden of Eden. And the garden is encircled by yellow police tape with the words, "Crime scene, do not cross." And the flood, you probably, many people have got, remember from the movie Noah, which 2 years ago, I think it was, the New York Times title of the review was "Rain Heavy at Times. Russell Crowe confronts life's nasty weather." So I'm afraid if you get your information about Genesis from those sources, and that's all you get, you may come around to the idea that the scribes who wrote these stories were deranged. But I'm hoping this afternoon that you might adjust your opinion and see that they were at least as smart as we are, and probably smarter. And their first readers would have had, who would have read their work and would have read them with comprehension and with profit. But I don't want to begin with either our present-day reading of Genesis, nor with those ancient texts immediately, but, surprisingly, with the 19th century, 1872 to be exact, when a former banknote engraver who became a decipherer of ancient Assyrian text, just begun to be known at that time, his name was George Smith, and he first discovered a 3,000-year-old tablet that had been brought to the British Museum from ancient Nineveh, which is today in northern Iraq. The tablet contained an account of the universal flood. And Smith's colleague in the museum, Sir E.A. Wallace Budge, describes what happened as he discovered the similarities. He jumped up in the room in a state of great excitement, and to the astonishment of those present, actually began to undress himself. By December of that same year, however, Smith had sufficiently recovered his composure, and I suppose his clothing as well, to deliver a lecture to the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London that began with typical British understatement. A short time ago, he announced, I discovered among the Assyrian tablets in the British Museum an account of the flood, which, under the advice of our president, I now bring before the society. So it's not exactly an exciting beginning. Today, we know that tablet that Smith read as tablet 11 of the standard version of Gilgamesh, and it was composed about 1200 BC, and that particular tablet is actually only one of the series that comprises the greatest epic from the ancient Near East, Gilgamesh. The similarities to Noah's flood, though, as Smith read, are unmistakable. There is a lone survivor of a universal flood. As the floodwaters begin to recede and the survivor, whose name in this case would be Utnapishtim, is looking around for, and also Atrahasis, there are several versions. He's looking around for a place to land, and he sends out birds, hoping that they will come back with a sprig of green. And in Gilgamesh, the bird comes back, the birds he sends out are a dove, a swallow, and a raven. In Genesis, the birds that Noah sends out is a raven and a dove and a dove. So that's the variation is to be expected, but the three is, I think, significant. The boat lands on a mountain in both the Gilgamesh and elsewhere, and it's the same general area as in Genesis. And there is a sacrifice on landing. So those are just a few of the similarities that made it very clear that there's a tradition being mined. Now, Smith's paper at first created a good deal of consternation, and you can understand why, for it seemed to undermine the inspiration and the uniqueness of the Bible, because this was earlier than the Bible, and we thought that Moses wrote the Bible under dictation, but that wasn't the case if we take this thing seriously. But as decades passed from 1872, and more tablets came to life, alarm turned to gratitude and appreciation, because we could, with the use of these comparative material, these texts that were similar, we could begin to understand Genesis on its own terms. So today, I would like to review some of those insights that enable us to do this. First, I'd like to look at the plot of Genesis 1 to 11 and to see what similarities it might have to a couple of ancient texts, Atrahasis among them. And then to look at some of the juicier details in there, like Adam and Eve and so on. But it's important to recognize that the biblical writers knew these stories. Why? Because they were scribes who had to undergo training. And one of the ways in which they trained to learn both Hebrew and to write diplomatic correspondence in Akkadian was to copy familiar texts, sometimes called as the stream of tradition. So they copy these texts, and so as they copy them, even though they're not going to translate them into Hebrew, they're copying them in order to learn the hugely complex syllabary. These become part of their mindset. And anyway, Mesopotamian literature was the prestige literature of the time, so that if you wanted to be in as a scribe, you would like to quote them. Now, sometimes they imitated them, but sometimes they subverted them in a kind of a post-colonial sort of strategy. So I'd like to then come to the comparison of the plot, so the general outline of the Atrahasis and Genesis 1 to 11. Here is the plot of the three tablets of Atrahasis. This is named after the hero, which means very wise. It's named after the human hero, named after God. It was published finally in its right order by two British scholars, Wilfrid Lambert and A.R. Millard, in 1969, so that this is fairly recent. some people, the British Museum was long engaged for a century and a half before these two scholars came to it and published the tablets in the correct order. And some people have said that the greatest unexcavated mound in the world is the basement of the British Museum. But at least these people were able to find out the proper order. Okay, so now that we have the proper order of this, we now know the context of the flood. It's not just a flood, it's part of a longer story. So here's the story. As the epic opens, there are no human beings at all. There are only gods. But there are two classes of gods, which I think you probably would suspect. There's an upper class behaving like gods, that is, doing nothing and being served and being honored. And then there is a lower class of gods, larger, who are who are bent or are forced to serve them, conducting the ceremonies that honored the gods in the temple, digging and maintaining the canals, and providing the food on the altars that the gods use as food. So eventually, this slave class of God rebel, and it's the first strike, really, in human history. They burn their hoes, and they burn their shovels, and they refuse to work. And after a lot of fussing among the upper class gods, they finally concede the justice of the rebellion, and they commission Ea, who is the god of wisdom, and the mother goddess Mami, Nintu I think she's called here, to devise a creature to take their place. And this creature is going to be made of clay and the blood of the chief rebel god. The chief rebel god, unfortunately, pays the price for rebellion. And the new creature is called human beings. And for a while, human beings do just fine as far as maintaining the universe and serving the gods. But after a while, they expand so that the land, to quote the epic, bellows like a bull. What that means, according to most people who have studied this thing, is that the population was not mortal. Humans were not mortal. They didn't have a lifespan. They could get killed, as the chief rebel god got killed. But the clock did not begin to tick when they were born. So many of these people would live, well, they would just continue to live unless an accident cut short their life. So after a while, the number of people outstripped the capacity of the land to support them. And their noise, which is a kind of symbol, is probably the tumult and the riot that would ensue when a large number of people are competing for a small amount of food and land. So the gods, who are not portrayed particularly well in this epic, begin to be disturbed by the noise, and in fact, many of them can no longer sleep because the noise just keeps coming up from the earth. So they try a few attempts to limit the population, all of which fail, and they decide finally to send an annihilating flood that will wipe out the whole thing. So they're going to end the experiment by a flood. But Ea, who is the god of wisdom who first invented and devised the humans, isn't willing to let his beloved handiwork disappear completely. So he tips off one of his favorite clients named Atrahasis and tells him that the flood is coming and to build a boat. So he does, and he rides out the flood. So 7 days the flood is high, and it wipes out everything. It wipes out animals, it wipes out all human beings. And then during that time, however, the gods begin to realize that they need human servants, that the garbage is not being hauled out, the canals are silting up, they're getting hungry, and the clothing that they would depend on people to provide, and this clothing of statues and so on, isn't being provided. So they finally decide when Atrahasis lands, he's given a kind of honorary state of he'll continue to live forever, but he won't be the seedbed of the new version. So they commission Ea to have a second version of humans. And what do you think would be some of the characteristics of version 2? Mortality, but also an order of celibate women who don't marry but work in the temple, childhood diseases. All of these are mechanisms for limiting the population. But the big one is mortality. So that is going to solve the problem. So we learn from this, though, we think of it as a simple story and kind of dopey. But that's not really what we should be taking away. This is really traditional literature that is exploring the relationship of gods to humans and of why, for example, there are limits to the human race, such as mortality. They're trying to get at it through narrative. And they're also getting at it with a certain amount of, with narrative touches, such as the gods are portrayed as somewhat bumbling. And the humans, while their lot is hard because they are created to be slaves of the gods without any qualification, nonetheless, they can take away from that the consoling thought that they are absolutely indispensable for running the universe, whereas the gods, maybe not. So it's that now we have to understand and respect the way they got at things. We tend, if you were asked an exam to talk about the problem of evil and so on, you would immediately shift into a discursive style, would you not? Following the example of Thomas Aquinas, right? You would reason about it, you would think about it, you would draw on earlier authors, but they would tell a story about it. We use story for illustration of a point that we are making abstractly or for entertainment. They use the story to convey serious meaning, and it's very hard for us to get at it when we are looking at it as if it were something that that is supposed to be entertainment. So, okay, so that's really what they're trying to do. And today we call Atrahasis creation. I think the best way to talk about it is a creation flood epic. I mean, there's ways of talking about it. I think it's just called that. But more accurately, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit more full than that. It's a creation of human beings. There is a fault, right? The fault in Atrahasis is easy. The fault is the noise that humans make, I would say, because of the overpopulation and competing for scarce resources. The punishment or the response of the gods, plural, polytheistic, is to send an annihilating flood. But at the end of it, there is a renewal or a redoing of creation, this time with an adjustment made. Now, if we look at the biblical Genesis, the opening chapters of Genesis 1 to 11, which everyone calls, which reasonably is the primeval history or the primordial history, we see something like that at the beginning. We see the creation of humans. Well, we see the creation of the world in Genesis 1, which has the creation of man in the sense of male-female in the sixth day as, in a certain sense, the climax of the creation. Then Genesis 2 and 3 gives us another version of the creation of human beings in the person of the couple, whom we shouldn't be calling him Adam. Adam doesn't get his name until Genesis 4, but let's call him Adam just to be a little bit easier. And then you have the beginning of sin. Not only sin, but the beginning of the spread of the human race, but it's unmistakable that this spread of the human race is a group that is sinful and rebellious against God. And then finally, after 10 generations pass, because if you just look at the genealogies, that there are 10 generations, it's then in chapter 6 that God decides that the experiment has to end. And because humans are perverse from the very beginning. So that a just God who cannot abide injustice, unrighteousness, must do away with it. And so the flood is decreed, but just before the decree really takes effect, God's eyes land on a righteous person who makes it difficult for God to follow through on that, because how can a righteous God destroy a righteous person? So he makes a covenant, an agreement with Noah, who builds an ark, gets his family, and gets animals in there, representative animals. And the flood comes, the two different versions are combined. And the human race and everything is wiped out, except for the fishes. We have to realize that they have a guide to survival. So but then the human race, but then when the renewal of creation takes place, notice what happens. God reaffirms the original creation, and the human race begins from Noah, because he was made correctly in the first place, so it can do that. Okay, so let's just look at, I've given some of this away already, but I'll just go by it. Let's look at how the biblical scribes critiqued or gave their particular stamp to this well-known story, this well-known myth, which you can call a kind of narrative template. It's kind of like it's maybe a genre, isn't quite the right word, but it's a kind of a narrative template. If you're going to talk about the origin of the world, where evil comes, whether gods are reliable, whether you can trust them, do they need us, why do they make us, all of these questions that would be particularly pressing for a world in which divine causality was taken seriously. It didn't mean they liked the gods. It didn't mean they were nice. It just meant that they took divine causality seriously the way you do with electricity, gravity, and other forces in the world. All right, so the first thing, first of all, they kept the basic plot, because you've got to have some orientation. They kept the basic plot of creation, fault, flood, renewal of that creation. But they did make some riffs, if you want to call it, mutations to it. And there is, let's see here. Yeah, they made three changes, and I think at least you can pick out three changes that are interesting. The first of all, the lower class of gods were built. The original, in Atrahasis, why are humans made? Humans are made because somebody needs to take care of the universe. So humans in Genesis, in Atrahasis, are slaves of the gods without any qualification. They have no freedom to do so. They can tell the story to make it look like they're important for the universe, but they can't get away from the fact that they are slaves of the gods, period. And they are created because the gods need to have someone to run the universe and to do the work that needs to be done, okay? Whereas in the book of Genesis, what do you find? If you try to look at Genesis 1 and say, why did God create? It's extremely hard to find any reason in Genesis 1. Now you can probably say, using the old scholastic dictum, bonum est diffusivum sui, it's the part of goodness to expand itself. That's kind of bringing in a later view, but there's a point to it. But if anything, it was simply God creates human beings, and God creates because God wants to create, period. There's no reason given. There's no need expressed. And the human race, which we'll talk about a little bit more, is given a very important and dignified task. But it's not the kind of task that would have been in Atrahasis. In the second creation accounts, the man is created to be a gardener, but the place that he is a gardener of is a very cushy place. It's got water coming up from below the earth. There's never any need to worry about the sky, looking at the sky to see if it's going to be a drought or anything like that. It's simply an endless supply of water, and he is living in the garden, which is an extension of God's palace, and therefore, in a sense, he's working in God's own home, because the palace, as often the case, as in Mediterranean culture, the courtyard is an extension of the house. So that's one difference. A second difference is between Genesis and Atrahasis is the cause of the flood. In Atrahasis, it's divine anger at the noise, and I mentioned that before, the tumult. And the noise is ultimately the result of the God's lack of foresight. Now, Ea is a god of wisdom who is rather admirable, but the one thing Ea didn't foresee was that the human race would expand to a point where the land could not support it. So in the second edition, version 2 of human beings, there has to be an adjustment made to the original design. And the adjustment is mortality and childhood diseases that are inherently limiting of the population. But in the Bible, humans are mortal from the very beginning. There's no attempt. Once you're made from, we'll talk about, you can also raise questions, if you will, about on the day you eat it, you shall die, as if he wasn't going to die if he didn't eat it. But humans, at least in Genesis 1, are mortal from the day they were created. Why? Because the human race all shares in the need to reproduce and to populate because they are mortal. The assumption is that all the members of the species are mortal, but the species itself is eternal. So God got it right the first time. And so when God says, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it in Genesis 1, it will be repeated without change in the repopulation in Genesis 9. There's no need for adjustment. Okay, so there's another reason right there. God got it right in the first place. And the third way in which the Bible differs from its pagan models is in its handling of the post-flood world. After the flood, Atrahasis, the survivor, is granted immortality. He happens to, they'll say, you are immortal, you were not mortal in the beginning, and we're going to let you stay in that state because you survived the flood. But in the case of Noah, Noah is made right in the first place, and therefore Noah himself can be the generator of the new race, the new population that's going to take place, and he, in fact, will be, his three sons will be the fathers or the progenitors of the three basic races that, we shouldn't be using race, the three population groups that constitute the world at that time. So he can, in fact, be involved in his own salvation, the salvation of the people. Whereas in Atrahasis, he's an appendage. It's the gods have to do it alone from scratch. So that's a kind of look at the way in which, kind of simple look at the way in which the biblical scribe would add a little more or give their own twist to an already existing and familiar piece of literature that at least the scribal class and maybe those who heard these things read to them could understand. Notice how it's the narrative detail that reveals the differences and not a kind of thesis. They do it by the narrative detail, which people would pick up and, I think, infer. I'd like to look now at at some of the more intriguing details. And I'd like to begin by singling out what we mean by the image of God in Genesis 1. I said that this is going to be very, we're doing this with just my favorite passages sort of approach. And then we'll look at the snake in Genesis 2 and 3, and then we'll look at Noah briefly. So God creates the world in 6 days, and he ceases from work on the seventh day in the book of Genesis. Now, if we were to imagine that chapter as a picture, the top of it would be a single line which talks about chaos. Chaos here, in our understanding, means usually uncontrolled and crazy action. In the ancient world, it would have been total inertia. No light, no motion, total water, destroying all life. But that's the beginning, is chaos. Then under that sentence, if you would imagine this as a column, are two columns. The column on, I guess you'd say, the right would be, the column on the left, I guess, would be days 1, 2, 3, and they would be matched by days 4, 5, 6, as you know from studying this thing. And on the columns on the right, the three are talking about, they describe the creation of the three domains: earth, sea, and sky. That's the way they look at the world: is earth, sea, and sky. Whereas the column on the left would be corresponding to that, would be the populating of those three domains by their mobile inhabitants, fish, birds, and animals. And then under the two columns, you would have the final day, the seventh day, which is outside the series of 6, in which God ceases from work and rests and declares it all good. Now, what characterizes all forms of life in Genesis 1 is self-movement. What moves on its own is alive. Now, this is really a common sense definition. I'm sure that people who are dealing with ethics and end-of-life cares would never be satisfied with that kind of definition, but that's the way they work at it. And if you look at the Hebrew idiom for running water, what is it? It's mayim hayim. It's living water, but it really means running water. It should be just movement. By the 6th day, all life forms in each domain have been created. And notice how the life forms are described. The life forms mainly are described as self-motion, as I mentioned, but they're also careful to talk about the way in which an animal moves. Like they'll talk about the fish having fins to move through its own domain, which is water, right? And then they talk about birds with wings moving through their domain, which is air. And then they talk about animals. They talk about not so much about the cattle obviously have 4 legs, but they talk about the remish, the creeping things. They like the idea of things with lots of legs because it's a way of describing how they relate to their environment, which is Earth. But by the 6th day, all the life forms in each domain except one have been created. Then, as something new is announced, the syntax shifts from third person to first person. God said, let us make man, humankind. Man in the sense, I can use man here, I think I'll use it, but I want to, it's man as male, female, and as I'd say also man as group, but let's say man as male, female. So it's not male. Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the wild animals of the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon earth. So God created man, humankind. In his image, in the likeness of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. Now, what should we notice? What things should we notice in this passage, which is extremely familiar to us, perhaps too familiar? First of all, God creates humankind and all life forms as mortal. They all have a lifespan. It's just assumed. Species are eternal, but members of the species die off and have to be replaced. And this is the main purpose of sexuality in the humans and animals, and in plants and seeds too. That it's very businesslike. It's to reproduce. Now, obviously, it's not saying that male and female husbands and wives cannot have a rich and loving relationship, but that purpose of sexuality is very significant. God gives a twofold mandate to humans, and I think we have to take seriously what God says to, quotes, the man in the sense of generic male, female. It says, first of all, have children and possess land. Now, among Orthodox Jews today, the mandate means that men marry and have children. It doesn't apply to women, but it applies to men in Orthodox Judaism. They take that seriously. Now, the possession of land is sometimes taken by people as something separate from reproduction. It isn't, I don't think, because how can you live unless you have land in a world where you cannot transport food from one place to another, and in a world where there are no stores, clothing stores, and so on? You have to grow your own food, wool, cotton, and flax, linen, and you have to so you need, life means having a land. So, and this is the most relevant for us today, and I'd just like to say a word about it. The thing that probably you carry away most from Genesis 1 is image of God. Now, what does image of God mean? First of all, I just want to clear up something. It's curious. You'll notice that it says, let us make man. And you say, what? Who is us? And the other one, God made man in his own image. So you get two different perspectives. How do you solve it? I think, Jewish tradition has always been correct on this, and I think actually mainstream Christian tradition as well recognizes that God is not alone in heaven. God, like any earthly king, has plenty of servants who do his bidding without question. And so in that ancient world and in literatures all around the people of Israel, they had what is called the assembly of the gods, the heavenly beings, who often met and discussed what they would do for regarding earth, and then in the case, but it would be presided over by a head god, a chief. And in this case, it's a vestige of that is maintained, but it is God that says, I will make man. But what does the mean to say? But I think what it means is this: the heavenly beings resemble God, and human beings resemble the heavenly beings who resemble God. So there's a kind of little striation there, a little hierarchy. But it doesn't mean that humans don't resemble God. But that's how I think that the only way I can think of to explain that particular thing. But the question I want to talk about now is, what does image of God mean? We know, obviously, that people say often enough this is used as a way of underlining the dignity of human beings. And it's been interpreted in two basic ways. This is being a little too simple, but I'll do it anyway. I know that there are church historians here who can say what they want to say at the end of it. But there's a kind of a substantialist interpretation, which was certainly dominant in the Christian church in the first centuries, and even, I think, in Judaism. And now, especially since the Reformation, but always there in some way, and it's certainly in the text, is the functional text approach. The substantialist view, which is a term that I'm not inventing, but it's not used by everyone, in which the image refers to the human soul mirroring its divine archetype. And this latter view owes a lot to St. Paul in Romans 5 and also in 1 Corinthians, and to the Platonic worldview that a lot of church fathers operated with. They looked on the heavenly world as the real world, truly real, and its form is shaping realities. And for example, here's an indication of a way of some of the fathers of the church. They distinguish between image and likeness in human beings. Image refers to our reason and free will, and that can be obscured by sin. And likeness to God can be lost, because likeness is similitudo. You are like God, and that can also, however, be restored by grace of baptism and the life of faith. So that's just one way in which that you can see that it's the substantialist view is looking upon image of God as contained within the self, and is not really seeing it. That's mainly its focus. Now, the functionalist interpretation takes another line, and it's especially, as I say, dominant today, not completely, but somewhat. It presumes that heavenly beings are servants, that the heavenly beings are God's servants, and they rule over the heavenly world. And God wants them to rule over the heavenly world. They take care of things, and they're God's servants. Obviously, God is giving them their orders and so on. So that human beings are analogously the same. They're ruling over the earth, and that image in this case refers to a kind of image of the king. A king might set up a statue or a huge inscription, which would kind of image forth his authority over a particular area of the world. And so in a certain sense, humans are representatives of God, and they are servants of God on the world. They rule over the three domains of earth, sea, and sky. That's kind of the understanding of image. In either case, you can see that image is meant to express and enhance the dignity of human beings, and to show that Genesis 9 says, if you kill a person, you will be killed. Reason? Because humans are made in the image of God. And that's a consistent theme in Christian and Jewish ethical reflection, and rightly so. So that's a way of looking at image of God there, because it is something that you could easily pass over and not recognize how specific it really is, and especially in its functionalist way. So whatever interpretation, it's clear that the image of God underlines human dignity and worth, and in the substantialist reading, humans have a similarity to God and to heavenly beings, distinguishing them from other forms of life. So that's an important point. In the functional reading, human labor is of exceptional importance, since it is delegated by God for the nurturing of the planet, in this sense, ruling over the domains of earth, sea, and sky. And I think that it's pretty hard not to make that one step further to Laudato Si and Pope Francis about ruling over. It doesn't mean kicking it around or exploiting it. It means caring for it and making sure that it's that it's not going to be used up in one generation's living. So I'd like to go now to a more colorful part, colorful chapters, and that's Genesis 2 and 3. And according to the story, and I emphasize this is a story you must take seriously as a story and not to import your ideas too quickly into the story. God lives on a vast estate that included an abundantly watered farm orchard on the estate. Such gardens, surprising to us, I think, were a very common feature of the Middle East in the antiquity, including up to Islamic times, up to the 7th or 8th century. And certainly they were common for kings and also for gods and temples in the 2nd and 1st millennium. So people would get that right off, that this is something that is not as strange as it might seem. So these gardens supplied food for the gods, they clothing for the statues of the gods, and for the personnel that worked in the temple for gods. But since the garden was on earth, God decided that he would make a creature that could take care of this garden, because the gods used food grown on earth. And so he makes an earth creature from the dirt of the earth to care for it. In this case, a male. I know that some people would like to say earth creature, but it's a man. I can't think that it's not. The women will come in soon, but not immediately. God was entranced with this new creature. And one of the things about this story is that God is really fascinated with the new creature. Can't get enough. He just keeps looking. It's like a parent with a new baby. They can't stop watching what this little baby is going to do. So it's like he observes closely to find out how this man is going to act. And he is told that he can eat from any tree in the garden except the knowledge of the tree of good and bad. The other tree, the tree of life, is there. You know about it as a reader, but apparently the man doesn't know about it. Later on, it's going to come in the story. But I need to explain about the ancient Near East. I'm going to stop here and do what I'm telling you not to do, to step outside the story, and say that there were two ways, if you want to be a little simplified, and to say that there were two particular ways in which humans were distinguished from gods or from divine beings in the ancient East. And the one was eternal life, and the other was superhuman knowledge. Now, the greatest epic from the ancient Near East, which I think some of you have read, is Gilgamesh, and he tries to find eternal life and heroically tries and doesn't ever find it. But he does find a certain amount of knowledge, and that actually is similar to some other things. So the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, therefore, in the tree, symbolizes one of those two marks or characteristics that distinguish humans from gods in the ancient Near East. The tree of life being the other one. But it's going to be all around the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And you might say, why do I say the tree of the knowledge of good and bad rather than the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? And the answer is, I think, that the word good and bad here is what is called a merism. It expresses the both ends of a spectrum in order to express the whole. Like, I lost my watch and I searched my house high and low. Or everybody was there, young and old, that sort of thing. So what it means is, it's a kind of a way of saying knowing everything, okay? That's what it means. There's a lot of discussion about this that I don't think it's as complicated as people make it. I think it's that kind of thing. So now, some people say God is testing the man. And I don't know, it doesn't strike me. I think if you look at the story, what God is doing to the man, see, the man has been invited into God's world, right? Who is God? God is all-knowing and all-living. God is intensely alive, electrically alive, and also knows everything. As long as the man is in God's garden, as long as the man is with God, what need is there for any other source of knowledge? You got it right there. And as long as the man is near God, what other source is there for life? You've got it right there. So I think what God is saying, and this is, I think, in line with the story, is God is telling the man not to eat of the knowledge of good and bad, the tree of the knowledge of good and bad, because he doesn't need it. And if he does take it, it means he's going around God's back to get knowledge that he doesn't need and shouldn't have, right? Because humans are not designed to be heroically everything. They're designed to be humans. They're not angels, they're humans. So I think that's what it means. And so it's like telling a child, if those of you with children, or those of you who were children, that includes everybody, I guess, that you are told not to stick your finger in a live socket where a light bulb should go. Now, it's not a test. It's simply telling you that electricity is good, but that's not the way to access it. There are other ways of doing it, like asking your parents to turn the light on for you. So that's how it's something like that. Now, but God keeps looking at the man, and he finds that this man is lonely. He needs somebody, he needs some help. And he needs animals, obviously pack animals and so on, and makes animals from the ground, and then allows the man to name them, that is to say, take possession of them, and then looks again and keeps looking and finds that man is still lonely. And there's something missing, because God is learning that man is not simply a creature of work, but there's another dimension that is not being met by animals. So he puts the man into a big sleep, kind of a anesthesia, and takes from man's rib, this time, not from the earth, and makes a creature that is similar to man. And when the man wakes from his sleep, he finds this beautiful creature in front of him, and he says, "This is the one that I've always wanted." And it says, they were naked and not ashamed, and that should be the first sign to you in a story that something is not quite right here. There's going to be something happening next. And now we have a completely new creature coming to the picture, a new creature comes into the picture, and it's an animal. It's from the animals that were created, and he is called the snake. It's not a serpent, and it is not the devil. That comes centuries later. This is simply a plain, ordinary snake. He's not as plain, I shouldn't say plain ordinary, because he can stand up and he can talk face to face in the same language as the couple. Okay, so that's not an ordinary snake, but he is a snake. He's not a huge beast. Now, why is the snake why does he talk to the woman and not to the man, which he should really by protocol? And what is he really trying to do? Why is he doing this thing? Does anyone have a clue? Anybody who was raised in a large family of kids would probably have a clue. But yes?
If you can't get what you want.
Well, that's a way of looking at it, but he hasn't asked Dad yet, so that didn't quite. I think it's because he was, as the most clever of the animals, they make a big point, who should have been the helper suitable for the man? The snake, right? And so who is the one who is angry and hurt and full of revenge? That's why he goes to the woman. He wants to prove to the woman, he wants to prove to everybody that the woman is not a suitable helper to the man. And that's why he wants to confuse her with what he says. So he comes and says, did God say don't eat any? No, don't touch any? She said, no. He misstates it. So then she starts misstating it, and then she starts to look at the fruit again. And the more you look at something that you're not supposed to look at, the more entrancing it becomes, right? So she finally takes it and gives it to her husband. I say that Eve gets a bad rep here for being a temptress. The husband is standing right next to her, so he's not tempting. He's there too. She talks. Okay. Then I think God discovers them, and they know only one thing, that they're naked. That's the new thing they learn. They're naked. So they begin to realize, what does that mean? It means they begin to have something is happening to themselves in terms of their capacities. God comes and, I wouldn't say punishes, recognizes simply the state they've got themselves into. So the serpent is cursed. He who wants to be the great friend of human beings will in the future crawl on his belly, and when humans see him instinctively, they will recoil. So it's the opposite of what he really wanted for himself. The woman is going to have to bear children because they're going to have to leave the garden, and the man is going to have to labor at a different kind of soil, dependent on rain and hard to manipulate, hard to work. What is God? Why can't they stay in the garden? The answer is because they've lost what they had, and they cannot exercise their sexuality in the house of God. That doesn't mean that sex is bad. It doesn't mean that in the least. It just means that where God is, you cannot have any vestige of mortality or of disease. That's why, that's why priests wear linen often enough when they go into the temple, because nothing was killed. Leather, not so good, because something was killed to make the leather garment. And so that they can't do that. So they must leave, and they tried to get what they wanted by going around God's back. And you say, what was their real, just let me finish here. They now have to live in a new world. And the new world they have to live in is a world in which life will not be gotten by simply being in God's presence, or knowledge will not be gotten by simply being in God's presence. Rather, they must live by generating children. And that's our situation today. That's really it's a way of explaining the fact that what did God really want us in the beginning? God really wanted humans to live in God's house. That was what he really wanted, to live in God's house and visit them every afternoon. But what happened was that's not possible. Humans were too inexperienced. They didn't know how to negotiate the holiness of the dwelling. God was still learning in a certain sense. God has a learning curve here, even though I know it might offend people who want to use omniscience and omnipotence too easily of God. God is learning. You've got to take the story that God enters into their world in such a complete way that God has to learn to see what they will do next. And so I think that's some of the things that are there. Now, last one thing is God said, on the day you eat it, you shall die. Well, first of all, the day of is simply a Hebrewism for when. But then Adam goes on to live 930 years, and you could say, boy, I wish someone would tell me that. But the answer, I think, is that it's not because mortality kicks in, because the human beings were mortal to begin with, because they were made basically from earth. I think it's this: they have to leave the presence of God that imparted life, and so now they have a lifespan. Now, his lifespan is huge, and later on lifespans will be reduced, but his lifespan is huge. And so that's how they come. And so now, what can we learn from our first parents? And I think that the answer to me would be, this is supposed to be part of the talk, is what can you learn? I think our first parents missed out on the fullness of life and wisdom originally intended for them. So God's really intent was this. But they did come away with a lesser version of each. In other words, when the man and the woman leave, they continue to live. They have children. And it's a more chancy and more difficult life, but they live. And they have kids, and good things happen. And as for knowledge, they did see what happened in the beginning. They have this sense of what God really intended for them. So that's a very important piece of knowledge that they have. But the story nonetheless ends with a loss, but not an irreparable loss, because it's possible for their descendants to access this garden of God and tree of life even in a diminished mode, by visiting God's dwelling, by seeking wisdom, and living according to God's word. And if you notice in the Bible, there are two books in the Bible where the tree of life reappears. One is in the book of Proverbs, which talks about the tree of life that is available to those who seek wisdom, i.e. Torah, earnestly. And then the other one is in the book of Revelation, in the description of the city that comes down from on high, the New Jerusalem that descends, which is a new creation that is going to be the culmination of the present world. And in that you have the tree of life, which means that it isn't been defeated by human sin. God still is going to make it available, even though it will be in the future where its full availability will be experienced. I don't want to go a little, just go on. Yeah, I just wanted to, we're going to have to skip a lot, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions. One question will be, which I think I'll leave for if the couple had not sinned, you might not be sitting here. Why? Because they never would have left. And they never would have exercised their sexuality in the garden, right? But we could talk about whether you think that's what people would say to me if I were to present this at a scholarly meeting. But I want to end with a couple of comments about Noah and Abraham, and then we can have questions if you like, or comments. Noah, one of the differences between the Atrahasis story and the Noah story is that when Atrahasis' boat lands, the gods look on and finally say, okay, let's give him a pass. He can live forever in some remote area. But when Noah's boat lands, God looks at Noah, who was made right the first time. He can have children, and makes Noah the progenitor, the new Adam, so to speak. And from his three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, come the three great population groups known to the ancient world, to the author of Genesis anyway. And so Noah is the first person in the Genesis 1 to 11 stories who has been given a role by God. And I think before everybody was reacting. God came, the man and the woman in the garden, they sin, God comes right in the scene. It's like a 911 call. He sees them right there. When Cain kills Abel, who's right there immediately is God. But with Noah, there's an invitation and the beginning of working together for his own salvation and for the salvation of the human race. And I think that Noah, to me, is a very important prefiguring of Abraham, because Abraham is where the story shifts and narrows to one family of the family of nations rather than to all of them. Instead of the 70 nations that are talked about in Genesis 10:11, you begin to have one family of those nations who is picked out and selected. And I think that you have to understand Noah, to understand Abraham well, I think you should see that Noah has prefigured him, that this man will be asked by God to work with God, to labor with God for the salvation not only of his own family, but through the other nations will be blessed through Abraham's labor, faith, cooperation. And I think that seeing it that way makes Abraham's entry less abrupt and less sudden. And in fact, some German scholars have tried to say that Genesis 1 to 11 has nothing that whoever wrote it knew nothing about Abraham, which I think is complete nonsense, because it's clear that Abraham's family is part of that huge migration of population that moves from the east and taking possession of the world. So anyway, these are some. Oh, I want to just end with something. This is the question of myth, because really I've been talking about it, but we don't want to use it. I would say if you're talking to a parish group, don't use the word myth, because the word myth in our language means something is false. Okay, so don't use it. Use stories of origin or something like that. But I think we have to also fact that this is really a mythological approach to understanding human beings and understanding something about God. But it's hard to talk about that and get it right. But there's a biblical scholar named Tryggvi Mettinger who is at, I think, the end of his career. I think he's been around a long time. And he's from Lund, the University of Lund in Sweden. And he says, he talks about myth this way, which is, I think, would win wide assent. The conditions of real life in the present are seen in a validating and explanatory perspective as being founded on events between gods and humans in primordial time. And I think that would be widely accepted. But I want to go on just further. And this is, I think, a contribution that he makes that I find very useful. He says, a mythic text relates to reality, not by referential ambition, like Caesar was murdered on the 14th of March in 44 BC, the 15th of March, I think it should say, in 44 BC, but by its universal applicability. In other words, texts have a reference beyond themselves, okay? He calls it a referential ambition, which is a nice phrase. And he says a fact, like if you're going to a class in history and you are studying World War II, you would use facts like bombing of Pearl Harbor, Hitler's rise to power in Germany, and so all these kind of things. And the text you would use would have a referential ambition, okay? But when you're talking about something like Genesis 2 and 3 or Genesis 1 or whatever, the text still has referential ambition, but it's not to a factual event. It rather is to universal applicability. In other words, you look at that text and it refers to something. It has an ambition to go out beyond itself, but its ambition is universal applicability. You learn something about yourself or about humans in general. And I think to me, that's a helpful way because it kind of puts into parallel the two ambitions of mythic material and historical material. So Paul Ricoeur says, don't say about something, it's only a myth. Say about something, it has the greatness of myth. So I think that with that, I'll just quit. Thank you for your attention.
Father,
Here's what I would say, at least I've written, I was a little more careful. The answer, I think, lies in understanding the way that God chose to relate to the couple, by observing and responding. God observed that it was not good for the man to be alone. He so created animals from the earth to be his helpers, but observing that the animals did not satisfy man's aloneness, he determined that the helper would have to come from the man's body. But why did God not foresee that the man needed a woman? Even more pressing, why did not God foresee the human race would become totally corrupt? I mean, the issue is even broader than that, because you could say, why did it take God 10 generations of human beings to come to the conclusion that he had made a terrible mistake and that he wanted to obliterate the human race? And what prevented God from annihilating the human race? And again, we would not be here if that had happened, right? What prevented it? It was the sight of a righteous person. That a righteous God cannot kill and annihilate a righteous person. I think there's a kind of immersion of God into the world that is being created here that leads to the kind of question that you asked. And I think it's a completely legitimate one, but it also leads to the kind of thing, why didn't God foresee that the human race was corrupt and couldn't be the seedbed of a decent population? And so I think that I would say that both are somewhat allied. And the answer would be simply that the story, in a sense, demands it, and that God is willing to follow the pace of the human actors. But it still leaves you with, it does leave you with a kind of surd in this thing. But I think there's an analogous, I have the same problem with regard to chapter 6, that twice he says, he said he was really sorry. He said he grieved into his heart, which means he really felt bad about it. but that was the way it has to be, because the justice had to be honored. And I think it's something like that's how I would try to argue in that direction anyway. But your question is a good one, and I think it's the one that comes to everybody's mind who thinks about this a lot.
Okay, well, thank you for that explanation.
Sure, you're welcome.
Okay, who else? Could I ask that you just speak as loudly as you can and also briefly tell us who you are?
My name is Ellen Goodwin. I'm retired from the English department at the Western Civilization.
Yeah, you know what you're talking about.
I want to follow up on that question because I'm certain of exactly what you're talking about when you're talking about the second because the second, there's so much friction in Genesis between 7 days of creation. And it was my impression that context of Genesis, first creation account, God says, "Be fruitful." That is not consistent. Second creation account, as you interpret it, that the man and the woman are of God's state.
Yeah.
So is that?
No,
are you saying you're referring just to the second?
Well, I think that I would say the demands of the story. I mean, that's a very good point, because first of all, they're two different stories, and there's no need to try to reconcile them. For example, in Genesis 1, the animals are created before human beings. In Genesis 2:3, they're created afterwards. The man and the woman are created together in Genesis 1, but separately in Genesis 2:3. Anyway, several more things like that. But you put it very well. But I think that it's a different take, it's a different perspective. It's like two people talking about some issue regarding God and God's relationship to human beings, two theologians, and they might be talking, one might give you a particular point of view, and then the other person might come and give you a point of view, but they would do it discursively and not narratively. And if they differ, then the narratives, for us, we look upon story. It's got to be, it's either this way, if it's, so I think that narratively they can accept that. I mean, you could, anybody in that, if you read Genesis 1 and then Genesis 2 and 3, any editor who puts those two stories together is not concerned about harmonizing of two different accounts. I would say it was something like that. I mean, you do put it, I mean, clearly they were made originally when they're naked and not ashamed. I don't know how to interpret that except to say that it's dormant sexuality, because at that point, it says that there was land outside the garden, but it wasn't productive because there was no rain and there was no man to till it. So I would say analogously to the dormancy of the soil would be the dormancy of their relationship. The nice thing about it is it champions affection and respect even without regard to propagation. I mean, it doesn't reduce it to just generating kids. There's a beauty in marriage of the relationship. But I think it's something like that. I agree. It does, I mean, be fruitful and multiply does have the impression that they're going to come pouring forth from the parents. But I think in this case, I think to me the only way to understand it is the immersion of God into the story, that God would have found a way. And I think the earlier question about God finding a way, I don't think they, at least in the usual understanding of sacrality, that sexual expression would have been permitted in the garden, in the temple. But there would have been, you have to let God find a way, because God is learning and observing and learning and observing. And I think that you would have to find a way that God would ultimately come to some solution in which they could be progenitors of children. But at this point, they aren't. And I think their sin really messes the whole thing up, and they're prematurely tossed out of the garden because God cannot abide in the holy place, human rebellion, which they are. They're going outside God's knowledge to find it on their own. So I think it means that it's idolatry as well as disobedience. We think of it as disobedience, but I think it's idolatry. Idolatry is when you go around God to find something that you should be finding from God. You know, Hosea is a great prophet of that. Did you have, was it, oh, both of you, go ahead. Okay.
Thank you for coming out. I really appreciate this. Bolster point for what you're saying.
Oh yeah, well, that's a question. I think that you have to look at it as the story, let the story be a story. I mean, if you take a point of view that if you're looking at it from a kind of a Thomistic angle or a more philosophical, even a non-Christian or non-religious, non-theistic angle, you have to look at things like divine omniscience and divine. But I think the story here, in a certain sense, in order to present God as a God whom you can relate to, there's a kind of limiting of God at the same time. You know, I think Luther talks about sometimes God's self, in a certain sense, self-limiting in order to communicate to human beings. And I think it doesn't do away with omniscience as philosophical categories. It's just entering, you have to enter into a world in which God here is an actor with humans, even though God, you can say God is pure act if you want, but the text isn't really moving in that direction. It's really talking about how God relates. God is intensely relational here. He keeps looking at this man and finding out more and more about him through the man's behavior. And then coming to be a God who responds immediately to the man's actions, rather than a God who is kind of above it all. So I'd just say immersion into the human reality and the willing acceptance, at least for this story, of a finiteness in order to make it clear to people God's original intent, which is one of wanting you. His original design was that you should live in God's house, which I think should be very reassuring. And in the way the Bible works, that's going to happen someday, you know, like in Revelation 21 and 22. Yes, Steve. Yeah. Yeah, good point. I think that whatever it was, it no longer is. Okay. So why would the text tell you that the snake is the cleverest of all the animals? I mean, there's got to be a reason, and every good story gives you motivation, right? You've got to know why this snake does this, and most commentators pay no attention to the motivation. You got to know why this snake picks out this woman to really destroy the life they have. Why? And I think to me, the giveaway is the most clever of all the beings, which means that who should have been. There's also a little Hebrew similarity between the use of the particle min that tends to tie them together. But I think it's basically why would they say it except that if he was the cleverest of all of the animals, why wasn't he chosen to be the helper? Because God looks and finds out the animals aren't satisfying this aloneness of the man. And who is there waiting in the wings, who is ready to go and be the helper suitable to the man? And nobody calls. And he can only stew, which he does well, and then he finally decides that he's going to wreck the relationship and show the world that this woman is the worst helper ever imagined, which he does to some extent. Yes, did you have something?
Thank you, Father. My name is Joseph Gazai. I am a senior philosophy major. I wanted to press the question that Father Leo raised.
Yeah.
And if God did not want Adam and Eve to have children in the garden, then why would he make them male and female?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think what I would, in response to those two questions, I would say that there would be a way found. You know, the problem is if you take a look at what was ordinarily the case with sacral places, expressions that would in any way suggest sexuality. Or see, the reason why it's forbidden is God is beyond death, and therefore there is no need for God to have any the Hebrew God, to have any sexual expression, because it just doesn't belong there, because God is without. I think that we could say if the story went on, you could probably want to answer your question this way. If the story went on, a way would be found. But as the story stood at that moment, with the snake entering the picture, then it crashed. So maybe that's the best way to do it. If the story went on, there would be a way of doing it. And maybe that's the best way to say it. And whether there would be some adjustment made or some means way, because clearly, when they made male and female, they're going to have to be the progenitors of a population, right, that comes from them. But I think that's how I guess I mean, I'm adjusting my own stuff to what those three questions have implied, that I think a way would be found, but because it was a story, the story just stays with the story. The story was this mistake they made, this sin that they committed. So I don't know if that satisfied you as a senior philosophy major. Maybe it doesn't.
I think we maybe have time for just one more question. Let's go over here.
No, I think that's it's funny, the Hebrew text says that the man was standing with her, at her side, him. Jerome, in the Vulgate, didn't put that in. I don't know why. But surprisingly, several modern translations do not put it in, for reasons that escape me. And it implies that Eve later went to the man and said, here's what you should be doing. You should eat this fruit. And I think that the man was right there standing. I mean, the issue, which raises the question of why talk to the woman when the man is right there, because he's supposed to be the head of the family, right? Especially in that culture. That's why I think she's not a temptress. Unfortunately, she gets a bad rap through interpretation later on in both Judaism and Christianity, at least in some circles, and it's completely unwarranted. They're together, and she's the one who talks to him. He talks to her. She talks to him. So it's not as if it's not a. But I think it's something like that. I think they're both completely equal. But notice what the punishment of the woman is. I shouldn't say punishment. It's the state that she puts herself in. When God recognizes, at the end, he punishes the snake because the snake now has to go in its belly, and people recoil. But the couple he doesn't punish. He really tells them what their actions have done to them. And one of the actions is that because you listen to the voice because the man, you listen to the voice of the man. Wait a minute, how's that work? In the check. Yeah, listen to the voice of the wife. Then you've got that kind of thing. In other words, you listen to the wrong person, and therefore your punishment, if you want to say it, is condign. It's kind of fitting and suitable. But anyway, the woman realizes that she has to leave the garden, and I think that she realizes that, to have children, in order for her to live, she's got to leave. That's the question that she makes that conclusion. But it doesn't mean that if they had obeyed, if they had rejected the snake, the story would have unfolded in a different way in which they could be both generators of children and companions, loving companions of each other. But we'll never know that because the story didn't go that way. I think that's the best way is to keep it open rather than to say it's an inherent illogical. I think it's better to simply say that. But anyway, thanks for letting me readjust.
I wanted to say thank you to all of our question askers, especially our students. Some great questions asked. If you should feel at this moment that it's really only the case that you're formulating more questions about how all this works, that means you're doing it right. And I will say also, I mean, if there is any text that we have that has been interpreted and reinterpreted, but in rich and sometimes very satisfying ways, it's this text. So what I want to say to you is keep pressing with those questions. There's much more to do here than we can do in this short time. but we're lucky today to have this expert guiding us. So please join me in thanking again Father Clifford.
Thank you. Thanks.
Remind you that if you're sitting here, then you're invited to join us.